The suppression of a people or of a society begins, in my mind, with the censorship of the written or spoken word.
To the world, he was the golden-haired troubadour, the voice of the mountains, the guy who sang with such open-hearted sincerity you just had to believe him. John Denver wasn't just a singer, he was a feeling of home, of nature, of a simpler kind of love. His music was the soundtrack to a generation, but one song, more than any other, seemed to capture his very soul. It was a love letter written on a ski lift, a melody that became one of the most romantic ballads of all time. It was, of course, Annie's song. For decades, the woman who inspired it, Annie Denver, was a silent muse. She was the name in the title, the face in the photographs, the quiet figure standing just outside the blinding glare of the spotlight. She lived a life defined by that song, a public image of idyllic romance that millions saw as the ultimate ideal. But behind the melody, behind the gentle lyrics and smiling photos, was a story of immense pressure, profound loss, and a truth far more complex than anyone could imagine. A story that, until recently, has remained largely untold. Now, at 78, the full picture of Annie Denver's story is finally coming into focus. She is stepping out from the shadow of the song that defined her to tell her side of the story. What she reveals isn't just the story of a marriage, but the story of a woman trying to find herself inside the hurricane of global fame. It's a story of how the man who sang "You Fill Up My Senses" was also a man of deep, unsettling complexities, and how their love was ultimately dismantled by the very success it helped create. What really happened behind the closed doors of their Aspen home, and why, after all these years, is the full story emerging now. The truth is more shocking and more human than you think. Before the stadiums, the international hits, and before John Denver became a household name, there was just John and Annie. Their story didn't start under Hollywood lights, but in the humble setting of a college in St. Peter, Minnesota. Back in 1966, he was a mostly unknown folk singer performing with a group called the Chad Mitchell Trio. She was Annie Martell, a sophomore in the audience. In later interviews, Annie would recall that first moment with perfect clarity. "I wore blue jeans, a lumberjack shirt, and penny loafers," she said. John later told me he fell in love on the spot. It wasn't a whirlwind romance, it was a slow burn, a connection that deepened over letters and phone calls for the next year. When he finally asked her to marry him, she actually said no at first. A moment of hesitation about such a life-changing decision, but her heart knew the truth. She recalled, "I changed my mind. So my best friend called John and told him to ask me again. He did, and this time, she said yes." They were married just 9 months after they started dating, on June 9, 1967. Early years together were painted with youth and shared dreams. They first settled in Minnesota before moving to the place that would become their spiritual home, Aspen, Colorado. Here, surrounded by majestic peaks and whispering aspen groves, they built a life before the chaos, rooted in a shared love for nature and a quiet belief in each other. He was just John, and she was just Annie. They were, by her own admission, young and idealistic, building a future on genuine affection. They were a team. As John's career started to bubble, playing small clubs and honing his craft, Annie was his anchor. The steady hand, the quiet confidant, the one who believed in the music before the rest of the world caught on. Those were the golden years, the time before fame arrived like an uninvited guest, before the pressures of a public life began to test the limits of their private love. Looking back, Annie has reflected on this time with a mix of fondness and a clear-eyed view of what was to come. In what has become a recurring theme, she admitted they were totally unprepared. "We were too young and immature to deal with John Denver's sudden thrust into stardom." She would later state, a sentiment echoed across interviews and documentaries. They had built a beautiful, quiet world together, nestled in the mountains, with no idea that the world was about to come crashing in. The man she married was about to become public property, and the simple life they cherished was about to become a memory. The 1970s belonged to John Denver. The obscure, folky Annie Martell had married transformed, almost overnight, into a global superstar. With songs like "Take Me Home," "Country Roads," "Rocky Mountain High," and "Sunshine on My Shoulders," he captured the spirit of a generation longing for something real. His clean-cut image, round glasses, and soaring voice created a persona that was irresistible. He was the friendly poet of the people, and he quickly became one of the best-selling artists of the decade. But as his star rose, their world began to shrink. The fame that looked like a dream was really a double-edged sword. John's career, as he himself later admitted, started driving a wedge between them. The demands were relentless. The man Annie had married was now consumed by recording sessions, TV appearances, and world tours that kept him away from home for months on end. For Annie, the change was jarring and deeply isolating. The quiet life they'd built in Aspen was constantly invaded by the machinery of celebrity. Public scrutiny became a part of their daily life. Their marriage was no longer their own. It had become a symbol of idealized love for fans to admire. and magazines to dissect. While John was on stage, basking in the adoration of thousands, Annie was left to navigate the dizzying new reality of being a superstar's wife. In a rare 1979 interview, she gave a glimpse into the turmoil, confessing to feeling insecure in their relationship, overwhelmed by the sheer scale of her husband's fame. The pressure created not just a physical distance, but an emotional one. John spoke about this in 1983, reflecting on their final years together. "I think over the last 4, 5, or 6 years, we started drifting away from one another," he admitted, "and part of it had to do with the amount of time that we spent not together. But behind the scenes, it wasn't just about the time apart. It was about how fame was fundamentally changing him. The ground beneath Annie's feet was shifting. The life she had known was vanishing, replaced by something loud, demanding, and utterly foreign. The emerging cracks were fissures in her own sense of self, ones that would eventually widen into a chasm, threatening to swallow her identity whole. Fame is a powerful force. It doesn't just elevate a person, it creates a gravitational pull that warps everyone around them. For Annie Denver, living in the epicenter of John's fame felt less like a privilege and more like a slow, systematic erasure. She has spoken about how fame didn't just damage their marriage. In her own words, she felt it erased her from her own story. This wasn't just a metaphor, it was her reality. Before the world knew her name, she was Annie Martell, a young woman from Minnesota with her own dreams and identity. But as John's celebrity grew, she became, to the public, simply Annie Denver. Not a person, but a persona. The muse, the inspiration, the quiet woman smiling in the liner notes. Her identity became entirely defined by her famous husband. She was, as she later admitted, lost in his shadow. This loss of self was a recurring theme in her reflections. She explained that the constant public focus on their relationship left her feeling as though she no longer knew who she was. The world saw a fairy tale, but she was living in a gilded cage, her own individuality sacrificed for his success. One of her most poignant admissions captured the depth of this loss. She felt she had lost more than a husband, she had lost herself. Imagine the psychological toll. Every public appearance was as John Denver's wife. Every interview question was about him, their life, and the song that bore her name. Her own passions faded into the background, secondary to the all-consuming demands of his career. She was the keeper of the home and the anchor for the family, but she was becoming invisible. To the world, she was living the dream. Privately, she was grappling with a profound identity crisis, feeling like a supporting character in the movie of her own life. This was only magnified by the adoption of their 2 children, Zachary and Anna Kate. While a source of immense joy, it also solidified her role as the primary caregiver, the one maintaining stability at home while John toured the world. She embraced motherhood with love, but it also meant her life became even more centered around the needs of others, leaving little room for herself. The story of Annie Denver is a powerful tale about the unseen costs of fame. While John was out, filling up the senses of the world, Annie's own senses were being dulled, her story rewritten by the powerful narrative of his celebrity. There is no greater monument to their levant, no greater symbol of Annie's predicament than Annie's song. It is, without question, one of the most beautiful love songs ever written. But to understand the full story, you have to look past the melody and see the song for what it also was, a gilded cage. The story of its creation is legendary. It was 1973, and the couple had just gone through a rough patch, even separating for a time. After reconciling, they had an argument. To clear his head, John went skiing on Aspen Mountain, riding a ski lift, overwhelmed by the beauty of the landscape, and a rush of emotion for his wife. The song came to him almost fully formed. He rushed home and wrote it down in about 10 minutes. Annie recalled the moment. It was a love song given to me through him. For him, it became a bit like a prayer. The lyrics are a pure expression of adoration. You fill up my senses, like a night in a F. Moments that made things unsalvageable. Their divorce in 1982 was anything but amicable. It was bitter, angry, and marked by incidents that stood in shocking contrast to John's public persona. His temper, which had been simmering, began to flare violently. The stories that circulated for years, which seemed so unbelievable, were true. The most infamous of these was the chainsaw incident. In his 1994 autobiography, Take Me Home, John himself described a fit of rage during their property settlement. He took a chainsaw and cut their marital bed in half. It was a shocking, symbolic act of destruction, the brutal, undeniable end of the fairy tale. The bed they had shared, the heart of their home, was literally sawn in two. John's autobiography also confirmed other moments of frightening aggression. He admitted that during one argument, things escalated to the point where he had his hands around her throat before he stopped himself. He wrote about the incident with a sense of shock. At his own capacity for violence, these were not just marital spats, they were terrifying. His extramarital affairs had also become a factor, draining what little was left of their connection. The divorce dismantled a life they had spent 15 years building. The love that inspired Annie's song had curdled into something toxic and unrecognizable. For Annie, this period must have been terrifying. The man she had loved, the father of her children, was behaving in ways that were not just hurtful, but dangerous. The music had stopped. All that was left was the dissonant noise of a marriage collapsing under the weight of fame, anger, and profound personal struggles. After the divorce was finalized in 1982, Annie Denver did something remarkable. She chose silence. She could have sold her story to the tabloids, but instead, she retreated from the public eye, turning her back on the spotlight that had, in many ways, wrecked her marriage and stolen her identity. Her focus shifted entirely to her children, Zachary and Anna Kate. This was her period of rebuilding. Far from the whirlwind of John's career, she dedicated herself to providing a stable, loving home for her kids in Colorado. This deliberate choice to remain private was an act of protection for them and for herself. It was a necessary step to heal from the trauma of the divorce and to finally begin the long process of finding Annie Martell again, the woman who had been lost for so long. She never remarried, instead focusing on her family and personal growth. Despite the bitterness of their separation, Annie's reflections on John are notable for their lack of public venom, often blending fondness and reflection while acknowledging the good and the bad. This doesn't erase the pain, but it speaks to a woman who has processed her past with immense grace. John Denver moved on, marrying Australian actress Cassandra Delaney in 1988, though that marriage also ended in a tumultuous divorce in 1993. He continued to struggle publicly, including arrests for drunk driving. Then, on October 12, 1997, tragedy struck. John Denver, an avid pilot, died at 53 when the experimental plane he was flying crashed into Monterey Bay, California. His death sent shockwaves around the world. For Annie, the news was devastating. Despite their history, he was the father of her children and a monumental figure in her life. His death likely solidified her decision to remain quiet. In the face of such a public tragedy, speaking out would have seemed cruel. She allowed his public legacy, that of the beloved, nature-loving singer, to remain largely intact for his millions of fans. For decades, she maintained this quiet dignity, living a life far from the public gaze and slowly putting the pieces back together. On her own terms for nearly 40 years, Annie Denver's story was told for her by a song, by magazines, by the narrative of her famous ex-husband's life. But with time comes perspective. And now, at 78, she has finally reclaimed her own narrative. This isn't an act of bitterness or a play for attention. It's a final, necessary act of setting the record straight. Her recent reflections, pieced together from rare interviews and public statements, provide the most candid picture yet of her life with John. She doesn't seek to tarnish his legacy, but to humanize it. One of her most crucial points is a clarification that cuts to the heart of their breakup. The core issue was the life that came with fame, the relentless pressure, the travel, the scrutiny. These were the forces that eroded their bond. She has confirmed they were simply too young and unprepared for the tidal wave of celebrity that hit them. She speaks with raw honesty about the deep, personal cost of that fame, confirming the feeling of being erased and losing her own identity in his shadow was a central, damaging part of their marriage. Her willingness to speak about this gives a voice to the often silent partners of public figures. And crucially, she has acknowledged the dark truths that have been rumored for decades. By confirming the stories of John's temper and the frightening moments of aggression, she isn't just telling her story. She is insisting on a more complete and honest version of John Denver. He was the gifted artist who sang of peace, but he was also a man who struggled with intense anger. What is perhaps most remarkable is her tone. There is no lingering hatred, but a sense of hard-won peace. She can acknowledge the deep love they once shared while being honest about the pain that followed. She can still get emotional when she hears Annie's song, recognizing it as a testament to a real love they once had, even while knowing the heartbreak that came later. At 78, Annie Denver isn't rewriting history. She is simply adding her voice to it, telling the world that behind the legendary love song was a real woman, with a real story of love, loss, and survival. The story of John and Annie Denver has always been a piece of pop culture folklore, presented as a simple ballad of a singer and his muse. But through Annie's honest reflections, a far more intricate and human story has emerged. Her decades of silence weren't empty. They were a time of healing and quiet reclamation. Her journey fundamentally changes how we see John Denver's legacy. It doesn't erase the beauty of his music. Annie's song will forever be a masterpiece, but her story adds a crucial layer of complexity. It reminds us that our idols are human, flawed, and capable of causing great pain even as they create great beauty. John Denver was the beloved troubadour, but he was also a man who wrestled with a volatile temper and the pressures of fame, a truth that makes his art and his life all the more poignant. More importantly, Annie's story is a powerful testament to resilience and the quest for one's own identity. For years, she was defined by a man and a song. But her journey since their divorce has been one of deliberately stepping out of that shadow and into her own light. She raised her children, found her footing, and chose a life of quiet dignity over public clamor. Her decision to let her story be told now, at 78, is the final step in that journey. It's an act of reclaiming her own narrative, of insisting that her life was more than just a footnote in a famous man's biography. She has transformed herself from the silent muse into the author of her own story. She has shown that it is never too late to speak your truth and define yourself on your own terms. In the end, the story of Annie Denver isn't just about the price of fame, it's about the search for self. It's a reminder that every great story has more than one side, and that true understanding only comes when every voice is finally heard. Annie Denver has found her voice, and in doing so, has given us all a more honest, more complete, and far more resonant understanding of love, loss, and the power of a life reclaimed. What do you think is the true price of fame? And how does Annie Denver's story change your perception of John Denver and his music? Share your thoughts in the comments below. And for more stories that reveal the truth behind the headlines, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell.